this is Edna Marie Anderson, and she's my mother. And we'd like you to talk to generations yet born and tell us a little bit about yourself and about growing up and some memories of your parents. Where were you born?
I was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We lived on a ranch
When were you born?
in June the 25th, 1923.
Okay.
And we lived on a ranch, or my parents lived on a ranch out surrounded by the Navajo Reservation. And my grandmother lived in Albuquerque, and that's the reason I was born in Albuquerque.
Which grandmother?
My grandmother Pitt, and she was my mother's mother. And so that's, and the first I remember, I must have been about maybe 2.5, 3 years old, because I'm 2 years older than Totsie. And I remember that I was really little, and my parents had homesteaded and had built a little cabin we were living in. And my mother was making bread, and it was really hot in there.
Now, where was the homestead cabin?
It was out about 10 miles south of Crown Point,
Okay.
New Mexico. And I remember that my mother asked me to take the baby and put her on the bed. And so I did, and it was really hard for me to carry the baby. And then my dad come in because it was so hot. He would take buckets of water and throw it on the walls of the cabin so it would cool the cabin down. And that was the first thing that I remember. And then it was just, they built another house out of upright cedar logs for a ways. We had a big living room and a kitchen. And then they built 2 big bedrooms out of rock.
Now, is this at the
Homestead.
is the homestead the same place as the ranch?
Yes,
Okay.
this is the ranch. This is where they finally built
Okay.
it and lived there.
It's east of Crown Point rather than south, I think.
It is,
I believe so.
probably. And I grew up there. I remember went to school in the 3rd grade, in the 1st grade and 2nd grade. We went to rented a house in Farmington, New Mexico, and I went to school there. And we rented a little house. I thought it was a huge, big house. There was an irrigation ditch and a bridge that went across it, and I had to wear a garter belt with stockings and everything. And when I leave the house, I go down under the bridge, take my stockings off, roll them up, put them up in the bridge, and go to school. And then I'd come back, and when I come home, I'd put my stockings back on because I was too hot. And then the 3rd grade, my older sister Marguerite had gotten a job teaching school at 7 Lakes, which was a little, there was kind of a little store there, and there had been some oil wells drilled there. And she got a job teaching there, and we drove from the ranch over there for a little while, and then there was a bad snowstorm come, and we had to spend the rest of the winter in a little cabin there at 7 Lakes.
How many kids were in the school?
There were Sonny and Tinker Ferris, which they were in the 8th grade, and Laureen in the 8th grade, and then there was Audrey Piet, our cousin, and myself, and Eloise, or Totsie, my sister Totsie, and then there were 2 little Mexican kids. We had to have at least 8 kids, and there were 2 little Mexican kids that lived in a cabin close there, and so they came to school, and we went to school there. And there was a big dam there in the lake, and that's the reason they called it 7 Lakes. And It was my job every Saturday to take a can to get oil to put in our lamps. That's why we had light, was oil lamps. And I was in love with Sonny Ferris, who was in the 8th grade. And so every Saturday I would be bathed, and then my mother would curl my hair around her fingers, and I would go down and get oil, and I would hope that I would see Sonny. And so I was going down to get, and I was skipping along, swinging my bucket and sing a song, and Sonny Ferris come riding up over the dam on his horse. When the horse saw me, he shied, threw Sonny off. Sonny jumped up, grabbed me, spanked me, and told me I had no business carrying his horse like that. And I said, Sonny Ferris, I'll never love you again.
He was probably just embarrassed because he couldn't stay on his horse.
And so that was when I was in the 3rd grade. And so we had a lot of cows that bad winter. I remember my parents lost a lot of cows because it seemed to me like there was a whole bunch, 50, 60 cows that died right laying down on the ice and snow on the lake. But I'm not sure how many. But and then the next thing I remember is when I was 9, it was my job to go get the horses that we were going to ride every day. And so I would get my horse and take off, and we had Russian wolfhounds that lived, that was there at the ranch. And I would get those Russian wolfhounds to go with me, and we'd go, and if we saw a coyote, well, we'd spend a little time chasing the coyote. And that was a lot of fun. And then I could hear the Indians singing early in the morning when they were singing their songs. Yeah, it was fun.
Saying their prayers.
And then my dad got a job as chief of police in a town in Gallup. And we moved in there and started going to school there. And I could go on and on for several
Keep
days.
going. Keep going. I think Virginia did 45 minutes.
I don't remember. I remember seeing my grandpa Pitt one time. I never did see him after that. I think that he and my grandmother separated. And he went to California, and that is where he died. And she lived in Albuquerque, and she was a quite large woman. And my aunt Ollie lived with her, and she had TB. And when Grandma and Aunt Ollie would come, why, we were very careful to boil our eating utensils and things that way because my aunt had TB. And then my grandparents, my dad's parents, my grandpa Presley was a doctor in Clovis, New Mexico. And I remember when I was probably 11, something like that, we went to Clovis, and Ruth and I both had our tonsils out. And I remember that I had to stay in bed, and it would pass out if I tried to get up, and I thought that. But my grandfather took me home that night, and they were having sliced tomatoes for supper, and I would eat those hot sliced tomatoes with salt on them, and it would feel so good on my throat. My grandpa finally made me quit eating them because I'm eating too many.
Well, now, was he a big man too?
Yes, he was a tall man. He was quite thin. He was real proud because he was in World War I, and he could still wear, he was an older man, and he could still wear his uniform. And the night that that they took me home from the hospital. Why, he tried on his uniform and showed it to me, showed it to us. And then, a little older, a year or two later, my dad and I and my sister Totsie had gone to Clovis, and so my dad said, go in and see if Grandpa recognizes you. So just say, well, we just visiting, we just down the road a ways. And so we went in there, and Grandpa said, hello, and he greeted us, and we said we had just come in there, and we're just kind of talking to him, and, well, what's your names, you know, and, well, we just kind of didn't tell him, you know. About that time my dad walked in, and my grandpa grabbed us and gave us a hug, and he started crying, and we thought that was terrible because we'd made Grandpa cry, but he was so glad to see us that he was feeling bad because he hadn't recognized us, but he lived on one side of the state and we lived on the other. And
Now, what was your mother's name?
my mother was Jenny Cornelia Sublett,
Okay.
was her name, Jenny Cornelia Sublett. And she was married to Bill Sublett, who, they lived in Camden, Missouri, I think. But Bill Sublett was her grandpa, and he was an explorer and went across and traveled with the Indians, and I think it was him that had an Indian wife, and he traveled all over.
He was the mountain man.
He was the mountain man, yes. And I always thought that my mother was Scotch-Irish and English. No, my mother was Scotch-Irish and a little French, and my dad was Scotch-Irish and English. And so come to find out that she was Scotch and he was Irish, but then they had lived in England.
Well, now, Sublett was a Frenchman.
Yes, didn't I say the
No, you said Scotch-Irish.
Well, she was Scotch-Irish with French. We
Right.
said she was Scotch-Irish
Okay,
with a little
all
French.
right.
And he had a little German in him.
Uh-huh.
And so,
Well, when you look at the older pictures of Grandma Presley, your mother, she looks very much French and Indian to me.
yes, she does. And but I remember after I joined the church, I was doing genealogy, and I was really excited because I had found out that this great-great-grandpa had been married to an Indian woman. And I was telling my older sister Maureen about it, and she said, well, you might have Indian blood in you, but I don't.
And then, what was your grandmother Presley's maiden name? What was her name?
Elizabeth Prunella Peters.
Peters.
Elizabeth Prunella Peters, and I never did see any of the Peters. Grandma Presley had been a little short woman, a very pretty woman. Pictures of her when she was young looked like my sister Virginia's pictures when she was young. And she was a little short woman, and when I met her, when I saw her, why, she was about as wide as she was tall. And my grandpa was skinny and real tall. My dad, Kelts Presley, was real tall. I could always find him if I could get above a crowd because I could see his hat above everybody else's.
Well, didn't you always take great pride in being a good cowboy?
Oh yeah, I thought it was. And my dad would, I would help my dad with the horses, and he would, when they got ready to ride, he'd saddle them up, and then he'd put a rope on them and get their head right next to him where they couldn't do much of anything. And I'd be the first one to ride him on several of them. My sister Ruth was one that did a lot of riding of horses the first time. But I did that, and then I always had to go get the horses. And used to play like, my sister and I would play like we were supposed to be out looking for cows, but we would play like we were chasing the Indians and having fights with other cowboys, and that the Indians were after us, and run around back and forth and have a lot of fun. Of course, there was no such thing as television or anything like that, but we never did have any trouble having things to do and I played like my name was Buck Curry, and I don't remember what my sister's name was, but that's who I was Buck Curry. Fact is, one of my names on my computer, when I first started using a computer and needed
A password?
a password, I said Buck Curry.
Well, I'm sure that's one that nobody'd ever guess.
And I graduated from high school in Gallup, New Mexico. Every summer we would go to the ranch and stay out there. And Daddy was chief of police for years, and he was, when they had the, after World War I, and when the banks failed, why, my dad was, they had some uprisings of the, I don't remember what we called them, a union uprising around, and he was, almost got shot, and one of the, guy that was with him one time, they traced a guy down that they were looking for, and they were going to take him in, and the Pinkerton man took him in the bedroom so he could get his things, and the guy whipped out a gun out of the dresser drawer and shot the guy. So my dad tried to do something for the man, and he was dead, so he took out looking, see if he could find him, the man. And they were at Osborne's place, and my dad kept looking, couldn't see, and then he saw a guy driving some cows. He was just driving along there, kind of little ways from him, not hurrying or anything, just driving the cows. But all of a sudden he realized that guy's stirrups were way too short for him. So he went over there, and it was the guy that he was looking for, and he was able to arrest him. And years later, I think it was even after I moved to Alaska, why, in a book that I was reading, why there was a story about that. I married, when I first graduated out of school, I married Jerry Mitchell, who I had been friends with and been my sweetie all the time I was at
Well, now how did you meet him? Did you go, was he in high school with you or what?
No.
He never went to high school, did he?
I don't think he did. I don't know for sure. We lived, I had some friends that, Elkins, Mildred Elkins was my friend, lived at Blue Water, New Mexico, had a ranch down there, her parents did, and I would go stay there. And Jerry Mitchell worked at the store there.
Okay.
And so I got acquainted with him there. He used to come and get me on Saturday nights and bring me clear back to what they call the top of the world. And we would spend the night dancing, and then he'd drive me all the way back to Gallup. And finally he asked me to marry him, and after I got out of school, and I knew my dad had said we kids could never get married before we was 18. And so right after my 18th birthday, I married him. And as we were driving away from when we got married at my parents' house, and he said, "You have gone to your last dance." And so I never did go to another dance. But things didn't really work out. And so we separated. And in going to dances and at school and different places, well, I met the Anderson boys, and so I married one of them. I married Elton Anderson, and then we moved out on the reservation and worked in trading posts, and we built a trading post of our own, called it the Gateway Cafe, and bought and sold livestock. And Jerry and I had a little boy named Jerry Allen. We named him Jerry Allen, and so when after Elton and I were married and we had the store, why Jerry would help me in the kitchen, and sometimes I would go to town and get things, and I would leave him cooking hamburgers and things for people. And how old are you?
I was 14 when we were at the Gateway.
And so he helped out with that. And then he had there was a little building out in back of the store, and that's where he had his bedroom. And I can't remember what it was. There was a hole that
It was just a little nail hole in up over the door. Was all it was.
and it was like a camera. Can you remember
Oh,
this,
yeah.
Terry?
Well, when somebody would come out of the cafe there, they'd get just a few feet up towards the little house that I had my bedroom in, and something with the light coming through that nail hole, it would invert the image and project it on the back of my wall, just like it was a movie screen. And I could sit there and watch everything that was going on. Nobody could ever sneak up on me because I could see them coming. Well, you had some experiences during World War II working for the military, didn't you?
Oh yes, I started to work as an ammunition inspector. They sent me to Penns Grove, New Jersey, to learn how to learn about the different ammunitions and how they worked and everything. And they had an ammunition depot in Wingate, which was between Gallup and where out of Gallup a ways. And so after I went to this school, I had a job working there. But I was married to Jerry while I was working at Wingate. And so I had to inspect all the cars that were loaded to see that they were loaded right, and watch as they were loaded to be sure that no one was doing anything that would cause the things to blow up. They didn't say terrorists because we didn't have terrorists in those days, but to be sure that everything was all right. And the steps going up on the docks where they loaded the ammunition, some of them were little narrow steps and some of them were wide steps. But you had to come up and down there, and some of them, they would pull a railroad car up there and they would unload the stuff, or we'd go in and inspect it. But they decided they'd make the steps bigger. Well, I was inspecting one night. I was working nights, and I come and looked over, and I thought it was one of the wide steps, and I stepped off, and there was no step there. And I fell and hit the ground, and had a hard time getting up. And I finally got up, and there was one guy, one of the workers that looked over, one of the foremen, didn't say anything. And so after I went back to the office and was getting ready to get off shift, he come in, and I said, "Boy, I fell off that and you didn't help me or anything." He said, "Oh, I thought you'd been there going to the bathroom."
Well, now the Gateway wasn't the first store that you and Elton built.
No. We built the store. My dad had this ranch, and on the edge of the reservation, he had a lease. He had a big grazing lease, and we built a store.
Heart Butte.
Heart Butte. We built this store down there, and first we I was trying to think what we lived in first.
First, we lived in a tent.
Yes, we lived in a tent. I remember a donkey coming and sticking his head in and braying and like scared us all to death.
Well, I don't remember the donkey, but I remember the tent, and I remember the Indians camped out there that Dad had cutting stone to build a store with. And I remember going to a sing with them and eating roast prairie dog one night.
Oh yeah, they would take the prairie dogs and just throw them in the fire, and then after they were done, they'd peel the hide off of them. And Jerry went out there, and Jerry was about
I was 5.
Jerry was about 5. Black on his face, he's just sitting there with eating prairie dog, having a gay old time. But we finally built a store and moved into it. And then we built a wareroom and moved into it.
You better tell us about the banana cream pie.
Well, Elton loved pies. He loved banana cream pies. We had gotten some bananas, and so well, there was a couple of
Well,
things.
we hadn't had any bananas. Things were real poor. We were living off of cottontail rabbits and beans and biscuits.
But we got home to some bananas, and so I remember 2 different things. Jerry was helping me with the pies, and he was just a little boy and was up, and I went to move the chair to where he could do it better, and I don't remember, I think he fell off the chair and fell on the cement floor and hurt him. But anyhow, Elton, we got supper ready, and he said, well, and we had fried rabbit and everything. He said, that was good if we just had some banana cream pie. And I went over and I had the pie hid, and I got it, and I says, da-da-da-da, went like them, put the pie over there. It turned upside down on the floor.
And Dad said, gee, I wish you hadn't done that.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. And we lived there. The Navajos would come in, and Elton talked Navajo to them. I got to where I could talk. I knew the names of things in the store. I could talk it a little bit. But this one guy that kept coming in, why? I didn't talk Navajo. I mean, he didn't talk Navajo to me at all. We just talked English. But when he'd come in, Elton always talked Navajo. And one day he did something, and he said, oh, you sorry. Talking, thinking that, I can't think of the Indian's name.
Didn't know he could speak English.
Didn't know he could speak English. And I kind of got behind him, and I said, Eldon, why are you doing that? Why are you saying that to him? Good grief, talking to that guy like that. He says, oh, you don't know what I was saying. And I said, I talk English to him all the time. But,
well, why did you leave the gate or the Heart Butte?
well, I was trying to think. That's a long time ago.
Yeah. That's 56 years ago.
We were going to go.
Oh, it was the drought and stuff. Broke it.
Oh, yeah. Had no rain or anything, and lambs that used to weigh 100 pounds, or weigh more than 100, 110, 15, when they were weaned. Why, they were just little 50, 60 pound, and we just went broke. And so then we started working for Pappy, didn't we? In Dilcon? Not for Pappy, it was for the that old guy that was so fat.
Oh, for Clifford Fouts
Clifford Fouts. And
at Dilcon.
at Dilcon. And so Elton was running that store. And then we left that and went to not Black Mountain. He has a
Salina.
store. Salina. Or did we go to where Wallace was, where the little kid said, me and Randall said,
Many farms?
Mini farm.
That was Mini Farm. No, I think I think we went from Dilcon to Castle Butte to Salina,
Yeah.
and I know we spent a lot of time at Black Mountain because
We
Pappy was there, but I don't think Dad ever.
well,
run the store at Black
we
Mountain.
we lived in that hogan up on top of the
Yeah,
hill.
that's right. We did. I remember that.
And and we lived there. And then from there we went to Ganado,
Mm-hmm.
and Elton was working at Salina, and moved into Ganado so Jerry could go to school at the Presbyterian school there, and so it. That's the reason that we. No, I was listening to her and lost my thoughts.
Well, tell us about going to Alaska.
Well, when I was a little kid, I had read a story about Alaska. And my sisters and I used to tell what and if stories. What and if, and then what and if I did this, what and if I did that. And I always said, what and if I moved to Alaska and built a ranch, had a beautiful ranch. Well, my brother-in-law and my older sister, Laureen and Elvin Lewis, and my brother Gary Presley and his wife Naoma went to Alaska, and they come back telling about the grass was 4 feet high and beautiful, beautiful land, and you could homestead, and you could get homesteads. And so they kept talking, and there were 5 families of us that decided to go to Alaska to raise cows. And so then the kids were all in school, so the men got ready to go, and they took off, but we heard that you couldn't buy anything, you had to take everything. So they took a couple of horses, and they took a truck with all kinds of farm equipments and stuff on it that Elvin had, and they took out and went to Alaska, and the women stayed. And Elton had been driving school bus, but I started driving the school bus while he was gone. And so then after school was out, Milton and Dorothy went with us, or did they go?
No, Milton and Dorothy and Virginia and Naoma and Laureen. Milton, Dorothy, Virginia, Naoma, and Laureen, yeah.
Took off to go, and they took all my kids.
Took all the kids, and I went also.
Elton and I had sold our store, the cafe that we had, the Gateway Cafe. We'd sold it, and on the condition that they got water there. And so I stayed there, hadn't got the money for it or anything, and so they took my kids and left to go to Alaska, and I stayed there. And then they took all the kids, and I guess they had a pretty rough time. The boys were in pickup with, in those days you didn't have campers to put on the pickups, you just put a tarp over the top of it and had stuff in there.
Well, we'd built a little, Milton had built a little shed on the back of it, yeah, a little camper, but there were stuff packed in the pickup, and then a mattress on top of that, so there was only about 2 feet left between the mattress and the top, and we threw Danny and Tony and Andy and David back in the back of that pickup, and we'd lock them up so they couldn't fall out.
Well, where were you?
I was riding in the cab with Milton and Dorothy of the pickup, and Dorothy to this day has never forgiven me for going on her honeymoon with her.
Oh, and of course I wasn't along on that trip, but I was at the cafe, and Elton had decided that we were able to sell the cafe, and so he come back and we were going to do that. And I was sitting in the cafe late in the evening, a guy was in there, and I was talking to him, and I saw him began to look real funny, and he kept watching, and his eyes got bigger and bigger. And I turned around, and Elton was right behind me, fixing to grab me. And he had come all the way down to get and drive me back up there. And so when I got back up there, they already had everybody in at a place in the Nilchik. And that's where we started out. And we got our separate places then that we were going to homestead. But we never did get our homesteads, because before we got them proved up on, why they quit letting people homestead. And so there was one that was pretty well finished, and it was the one that Jimmy and Virginia Wilson were going to have. And so we did get that one, but the rest of them we didn't.
Well, all they got was a 5-acre home site out of it. They
Yeah.
didn't get the full
They didn't get the.
homestead.
Oh no, they hadn't planted or done the things they were supposed to, so they did get a home site out of it. That's all I can remember.
Well, we'll take a break and maybe do a little bit more tomorrow or something.
Crystal came here.
When were they having